Afternoon. Now we're here. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Merle Massey. I'm the coordinator for undergraduate research here at the University of Saskatchewan. And with us to help us think through good practices in science writing and to make your science writing easier for a wider audience, we have with us USask writing specialist Jill McMillan. Jill's going to keep her video off for the presentation, but she'll turn it on for the questions at the end. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jill.
All right, thanks so much for inviting me to give this talk on this Wednesday afternoon. Oh, here we go. So the agenda for today's session looks like the following. We're first going to dig in a little bit into the purpose and principles that underpin scientific writing, and then we're going to just really focus on some pragmatic strategies. So really writing tips that you can start implementing right away in your writing with the intent of improving clarity. So we're going to consider the role of topic sentences, the benefits of reducing subject length, the benefits of using concrete language, some strategies for creating flow, and some tips for writing more concisely. And then I'm happy to share some recommended resources with you. So when we think about the purpose of scientific writing, it's all about ensuring that it's understandable for your intended reader. So this reader might have a lot of specialized knowledge already, and you might be occupying a very specialized space and communicating with that reader. But you want to make sure that that person, that audience understands your work, but also believes in your work. So understands that the value of what you are sharing with that person and with the larger field. And when we're thinking about scientific writing, sort of its reason for being, that it's guided by principles of transparency and reproducibility, with the intent that if someone else wanted to conduct a similar experiment, for instance, that they would have sufficient information to do so. Okay. In other words, I'd like to share this quote: "Scientific writing remains an exercise in convincing another scientist of the validity of your work." And this comes from an epidemiologist who had, in 2007, had already authored more than 200 scientific articles. So we might take this from a person of experience, this insight. All right, so when we approach the writing of any sort of text, we ask ourselves a lot of questions as the person who is going to craft that text. And when it comes to scientific writing, I suggest sort of the following questions that you might ask yourself when taking on this type of writing. So the first is to ask questions about who that intended reader is. So what knowledge should they already possess? What information will they need to know in order to really understand what you're trying to communicate with them and share with them? Next, ask questions about the purpose. Why is it important that other people have this knowledge that you want to share with them? And is there anything that you want them to do with this information? And then ask questions about genre. So what kind of structures are you expected to follow? And a lot of the scientists generally, especially if you're writing up the results of an experiment or a research study, often you're going to follow a very conventional structure of an introduction, methodology, results, and discussion. But maybe you're writing a different type of text. And so what would be the structures that you need to be mindful of in that instance? And then how about organization? So when you are writing your literature review, for instance, how are you going to organize that section? Are you going to make decisions based on grouping information thematically or chronologically? And then ask questions about style. What's the expected style or tone? How will you achieve this in your writing? And then questions about flow. What kind of techniques can you use to help readers move from one idea to the next? Next, presentation. How are you going to present data? Are you going to make use of figures, of tables, in addition to the prose that is forming the basis of the text? And then returning to our reader, because our reader is ultimately the most important factor when creating any sort of text. So how are you going to ensure that readers can easily read that final work? So ensuring that they fully understand what you're trying to communicate to them. All right. So when we return to the reader time and time again, the reason we do this is for many different reasons, but I really like this quote. I think it sums it up. It does not matter how pleased an author might be to have converted all the right data into sentences and paragraphs. It matters only whether a large majority of the reading audience accurately perceives what the author had in mind. So it's always coming back to this notion of clarity and understanding, ensuring that the intended message is received appropriately. All right, so let's start looking at some sample pieces of text, and I would encourage you to share in the chat box which of these samples of writing you prefer, and possibly a brief explanation as to why you prefer one sample to the other. So I'll read through both of them together, and then you can share which is your preference. So the first sample reads as follows. Remote sensing technology is widely used in river ice research, in which safety concerns prevent the use of direct measurements. One remote sensing technology is RADARSAT-2, a satellite used by researchers to obtain geospatial information. Using RADARSAT-2, researchers can document the spring melt of lake ice, showing different breakup initiation rates. RADARSAT-2 also helps them to determine ice thickening rates and to track differences in polarization backscatter, a process used to discriminate lake ice from open water. All right, let's look at our next sample, sample 2. The utilization of remote sensing technology in river ice research, a field in which significant safety concerns play a role in the prevention of the use of direct measurements, has become widespread. Geospatial information can be obtained through the use of a satellite, which is known as RADARSAT-2. The documentation of different initiation dates of ice on freshwater lakes during the melt of lake ice in spring can be achieved through the utilization of this important technology. The tracking of differences in polarization backscatter, which is a procedure that can be of assistance in the process of discriminating lake ice from open water, is another use of RADARSAT-2. The determination of the rates of ice thickening can also be made through the use of RADARSAT-2. All right. So when looking at those two samples, which is your preference as a reader? Sample 1, sample 2, and what is accounting for this preference? Starting to see some emerging preference for that first sample. And some of the responses are sort of clustering around shared ideas of clarity and directness, but also identifying the fact that it's not perfect. And there is seldom a piece of perfect writing. And being aware of how we can always continue to refine writing is really, really important. But in engaging this sort of reflection and this sort of comparison exercise, I think what's really useful is we start clarifying for ourselves, hey, how am I responding to writing in this situation? What's accounting for these preferences? And importantly, if I am preferring a certain style of writing, are there ways in which I can deconstruct that text, figure out what kind of writing techniques are being used, and apply them in my own writing? So if we were to compare these two pieces of text, we might say that, okay, here are some of the advantages to that first version compared to the second version. In the first version, we have a clearer topic sentence, we have shorter subjects, it's less abstract, there's a stronger flow, and it's more concise. I'm not sure if you would have picked up on this when I was reading through both of those samples. I was actually starting to lose my breath a little bit when I was reading that second version. And that's often an indication that maybe text is a bit too wordy, for instance. So some of the other issues that emerged in that second example, a more convoluted topic sentence, longer subjects, much more abstract language being used, a weaker flow, and as already noted, just more words when fewer would be appropriate. So this brings us to the focus of much of our session today. Tips that center on the following: using more effective topic sentences, improving our sentence structures, reducing abstractions, creating flow with spotlights on the old new information technique and parallelism, and then strategies for writing more concisely. All right, so we're going to jump right back in to this notion of gauging our preference for one piece of writing over another. So this is an excerpt from an article published in Biodiversity Research. We'll look at sample 1 and then sample 2, and I would encourage you to share in the chat which do you prefer and what's accounting for that preference. So sample 1 reads as follows. Over the past 2 decades, robust evidence demonstrating the significant impact of the feral cats on Australian native mammals has emerged. Feral cats preferentially select small mammals as prey, and native mammal reintroduction programs have failed due to feral cat predation. Frank et al. Demonstrated that even low densities of feral cats have the ability to rapidly extirpate populations of reintroduced rodents in northern Australia. Sample 2. Feral cats preferentially select small mammals as prey, and native mammal reintroduction programs have failed due to feral cat predation. Frank et al. Demonstrated that even low densities of feral cats have the ability to rapidly extirpate populations of reintroduced rodents in northern Australia. So what's your preference and what's accounting for that preference? Feel free to share in the chat. Quickly, when I have shared this example, often people's preference is quite split because there will often be reference to the benefits of the second example because just visually, it's a lot more concise. We can see it's less wordy. There are fewer literal words in that example. However, this is where I think we always have to be mindful of context and what text is adding to a situation. So in this example, it may be that having that that extra sentence actually has many advantages, because if someone is encountering this information for the first time and they didn't fully appreciate the research context, then the way in which they are engaging with some of the detail that is shared later around the notion of feral cats, it might not have as much significance for them, because this one sentence actually achieves a lot in terms of framing this topic, because we're looking at this broader issue of feral cats in relation to native mammals. We have a little bit of reference to a research context, so we know that this is something that is of interest to researchers. We have a sense of how long this research has been sort of emerged as an area worth investigating. So thinking over the last 20 years, and quite notably the geographic context. So in an Australian context, the impact of domestic cats that have since become feral is much more significant, perhaps, than in other geographic locations. So sometimes actually having a little bit more information in the form of a topic sentence, you can actually convey a lot of very relevant context to your readers. So it's always about achieving that balance of what information do our readers require in order to really value the work that we want to share with them. So something for us to contemplate. All right, but let's look at some additional samples of text. So again, the same question. We'll read through both of these examples, and I'd ask you to share your preference. So let's look at sample 1. The evolution of human behaviors through the adaptation of people to the new and changing conditions of hydrological systems due to climate change suggests that a continuous reassessment of water demand models is necessary. All right, sample 2. As hydrological systems evolve in response to climate change, humans adapt to these new conditions. To monitor how changing human behavior impacts water systems, researchers need to continually reassess water demand models. Which one do you prefer? Sample 1, sample 2, and what accounts for that preference? Interesting to see how what's driving someone's response. Sometimes there's a very strong positive reason why someone might be drawn to one piece of writing over another, or sometimes it's a reaction against how much they really do not like one of the examples. So the other one becomes more appealing just because of that sense of comparison. So we're seeing that trend where, sample 1 is sort of quite difficult to navigate. You have to hold a lot of information in your mind as you're just reading through that sentence, even though grammatically it might be perfectly fine. So we're seeing here a couple of different issues. We have this distinction between active and or passive and active voice, for instance. We have one really long sentence as opposed to multiple shorter sentences. But we're also seeing this issue with subject length. So I've highlighted in sort of this coral color, trying to capture the subject length in both examples, and how that relates to the central verb. And so in that first example, we have this really long subject length before we actually get to the part in the sentence where we actually see what's happening. And so we just have to hold, again, more information in our minds in order to extract meaning from the piece of writing. So the more clear we can be about reducing that distance between the subject or the doer and the action or the verb, it's going to make the who and the what of a sentence just much easier to understand. And that's what we want to do when we're communicating with our readers, is ensure that they are receiving the message that we intend, because it's all about reducing possible miscommunication. All right, so let's look at more writing. So again, which do you prefer and why? So sample 1 reads as follows. Here we demonstrate that much less expensive carbon sources can be used without purification to grow high quality monolayer graphene directly on the backside of copper foils under the H2R flow. Sample 2. Here we demonstrate that much less expensive carbon sources, such as food, insects, and waste, can be used without purification to grow high-quality monolayer graphene directly on the backside of copper foils under the H2R flow. For food, a Girl Scout cookie and chocolate were investigated. For waste with low or negative monetary value, we used bulk polystyrene plastic, a common solid waste, blades of grass, and dog feces. For insects, another often negative value carbon source, a cockroach leg was used. What's your preference as a reader, and what might be accounting for that preference? A bit of a split in terms of preference, because I think often in science writing that we're always trying to balance this tension between how can we be concise while ensuring that readers have enough information. And it's a balance that it might not be perfectly struck in either of these examples. But if you find that you're gravitating toward that second sample, then it might be that you're responding to something very specific, something to do with the type of detail that is being provided. And so that detail that we have is really coming across through this concrete language. And I've highlighted some of the examples in that piece of writing. So from your perspective, what might be a benefit of concrete language? And just for context, concrete language refers to language that can be sensed by any of the 5 senses. So from your perspective, what might be a benefit of concrete language? That verb grounds in this context, because it really is about reminding readers that this research is taking place in the real world. It's not taking place in a purely theoretical environment. It is it's reminding us, it's connecting us to the world in which we live. And so connecting to our senses via such language choices, it can make text that's more resonant for our readers, and consequently improve understanding of what is being communicated. So helping to anchor the broader concepts with the more easily perceived detail that is shared. So we're really relying on people's lived experience and their imagination to be able to visualize or somehow sense the information that's being communicated, right? A Girl Scout cookie, a blade of grass, a cockroach leg. These are all things that can be touched. They are very tangible. They can be smelled. They could be tasted. I don't know that you ever want to taste a cockroach leg, but it exists in the realm of possibility. So again, concrete language is all about what can be sensed through sight, touch, sound, taste, smell, whereas more abstract language centers on ideas and concepts. And often in academia, we become very comfortable operating in the abstract, but sometimes it's to the detriment of our writing, because we sometimes forget to connect these abstract concepts to things that can be more readily sensed or perceived. All right, let's look at some more writing. So again, we'll look at sample 1, sample 2, and then ask you to comment on the one that you prefer as a reader. All right, so our first sample reads as follows. Among various strategies, biofortification is a balanced, economical, and sustainable approach to reduce nutritional deficiencies globally. Biofortification of pulse crops, including pea, is one of the major objectives of the breeding program at the Crop Development Center, University of Saskatchewan. Sample 2. Among various strategies, biofortification is a balanced, economical, and sustainable approach to reduce nutritional deficiencies globally. One of the major objectives of the breeding program at the Crop Development Center, University of Saskatchewan, is the biofortification of pulse crops, including pea. So, which do you prefer? What might be accounting for that preference? Feel free to share in the chat. Um, I had to laugh about Merle's comment regarding wanting to know more about what is biofortification. Um, Basically, it's according to the internet, it involves breeding crops to have higher levels of essential nutrients through selective breeding. But yeah, I think with these two pieces of writing, neither of them is terrible, right? We're not psychically screaming at either of these in comparison with some of the other examples that we've seen. But we have some emerging preference for that first example. And again, the purpose of activities like this is really for you to reflect on what you are drawn to as a reader, to figure out, hey, are these strategies that make sense for me when creating my own text? So if you are drawn to that first example, it's likely because you're responding to what's referred to as the old new information technique, where basically, I'll just go back for a minute. Basically, we are taking the shared information between two sentences, and we are foregrounding that at the beginning of our subsequent sentences. So if we are agreeing that this notion of biofortification is that shared focus, then it might make sense to bring reference to that concept into proximity, into closer proximity. Whereas in that second example, the focus sort of shifts a little bit because we are providing more information about the Crop Development Center before making reference to that shared focus of biofortification. So the old new information technique it's a really simple premise, and it can be quite effective in that all we do is we take the sort of shared information or that old information that's already been communicated, and we put that at the beginning or close to the beginning of the next sentence before introducing our main verb. And so what this is doing, it's really forcing us to think about how sentences relate to each other, and then making the connections quite overt. So it becomes a very, it almost creates this very, this great sense of flow between one sentence to the next. Now, there are variations within this technique that we're going to also consider. But here we just have another piece of writing that is making use of that old new information technique throughout multiple sentences. So if we were to read through this, we'll start seeing, hey, how is this shared information being inserted at the beginning of each sentence that follows? So antibiotic-resistant microorganisms have significantly compromised antibiotic treatment, a large proportion of resistance. So that is speaking immediately or very closely to information that came before. In gram-negative bacteria can be attributed to resistance gene cassettes contained within a site-specific recombination system, termed the integron. Mobile cassettes contain genes that confer resistance to nearly every major class of antibiotic and some disinfectants. New gene cassettes continue to be identified, and the sequence of over 60 cassettes are deposited in the GenBank EMBL databases as of January 2001. This rapid increase in the identification of gene cassettes has led to the same name being given to two different gene cassettes, or the incorrect naming of gene cassettes. So it might be that we don't have this specialized knowledge to really understand the content of a piece of writing like that, but that's fine, because that's not really our focus. We're really looking at how language is being very intentionally used to sort of piggyback on information that has already been shared with the reader. So you're sort of taking this, these, again, incremental steps to ensure that the reader always has a clear understanding of how information is slowly building. Yes, yeah, and it does speak to the importance of how we name our files. An unintended but very useful comparison or connection with one of the other SURE workshops. All right. Now, one of the really nice things about the old new information strategy is that you can there's flexibility. So if you don't want to keep repeating the same words all the time because it might just get kind of boring to do so, you can make use of a structure that uses a this or these plus a noun, or you can make use of synonyms too. So you have quite a bit of flexibility. And I think that's always really useful when thinking about any writing technique, is how much flexibility is available to you as a writer. Because often when there's more flexibility, it just means that you have multiple strategies that you then get to rely on in putting your text together, which is what I think we always want as writers. So we can substitute those words with this or these plus a noun, and often that will be an abstract noun. So let's see it in action. So here, Skypes and Wilson found that short bursts of intense exercise showed more benefits than longer but less intense workouts. This finding is consistent with those of other researchers. So this finding very clearly references the results of that research study that were referenced in the preceding sentence, but we don't have to repeat all of that information about the detail of those research results because we're capturing it with that kind of phrase of this finding. So just one of the bits of technique we can keep in our writerly toolkit. Now, another thing that we want to be mindful of is the role of parallelism and parallel structures in our writing. And this can help with flow because it's all about organizing information for readers. And I think it's really important to have an awareness of a parallelism, especially if you find yourself writing complex lists in your prose. I think we often have a sense of the importance of parallelism if we're making a bulleted list, for instance, but it's equally important if we are writing a list in extended prose. So the benefit is that it just sort of creates this nice predictability, which means that readers are really focusing on the content and not becoming distracted by how the content has been organized. Often I think that the most effective writing is writing that doesn't draw attention to itself. And it ensures that we are just focusing on the content. We're not wondering, hey, why did this author do this? It just seems to be sensible and natural. But of course, what we may not appreciate all the time as readers is that such writing is often the result of multiple drafts. So there's a lot of writing and work that goes into making text more readable and more clear to us. All right, so here we have an example of parallel structures in action. This is taken from an article all about earthworms in a North American context. Again, the topic is less interesting to us than how the information has been organized. So let's take a look. 3 broad ecological groups have been described, including epigeic species, which live and feed exclusively in the litter layer, endogenic species, which live and feed in the mineral soil horizon, and anesic species, which burrow deeply but feed primarily on fresh surface litter. Let's break it down. So in looking at a piece of text like this, we might first notice, okay, we're making use of a lot of semicolons. And the semicolons have a very deliberate function here because they're really helping to organize the information and signal that there's going to be another element appearing in this extended list. So I've used some color coding to help break this text down. So we have in this sort of coral color, when we're introducing the list, we are already noting that there are 3 groups. And so readers will perhaps unconsciously prime themselves to be on the lookout for, okay, I'm expecting reference to group 1, 2, and 3. And that expectation is fulfilled because then we have reference to species 1, species 2, species 3. And they're not labeled with numbers, but we have those species following in short order. So it's easy to sort of keep in mind, okay, we have the expected number of groups that were identified at the very start of the sentence. Then we have that function word of which is introducing a relative clause in each example. Then we have verbs that are providing additional detail about each species that has been identified: live and feed, burrow but feed. We have a little bit of disruption of that pattern, but because disruption happens at the end of the list, it's less distracting for us. And so this is a very strong authorial choice to control when that pattern is going to become disrupted and manage it appropriately. And then we have a bit more information about where the action is taking place. So we have reference to the litter layer, the narrow soil horizon, and that surface litter. So thinking about how we can make use of parallel structures to keep things nice and organized is something that we really, again, want to be mindful of whenever we have a lot of information that we're going to present in an extended list, in sort of comparable to this example. All right, let's take a look at some more text. And I think that this is our final example before we start to wrap up. So again, which do you prefer and why? So our first sample reads as follows. Scientists recently utilized computer models to highlight how certain angiosperms become dominant in frequency when mammalian herbivores are preferentially excluded from gaining access to forest habitats. Sample 2. Scientists recently used computer programs to show how some plant species become common when rabbits and deer are prevented from accessing forests. What is your preference and why? It's really interesting how conversation evolves when looking at these two pieces of writing, because we often will gravitate toward that second sample because it is just so much more understandable. But then we might start wondering, oh, but is it, would we be able to use it in different contexts? And so this is where I think it's always really important, again, to gauge how you respond to different types of writing and think about the context and your audience. So if we were to look at these two pieces of writing, the information that's being communicated is basically the same, except the language choices are different. We have more abstract, more technical language in that first example, and plainer, more clear language in the second. And that's often why we're going to gravitate toward that second example. So there are shifts that are always happening in academic writing contexts. And certainly we're seeing that with increasingly journals are either asking or even requiring that things like plain language abstracts are being included when submitting to journals. So I think we are starting to see a shift toward that second style of writing. But as much as anything, you want to ensure that you are operating within the expectations of your discipline. And the way in which you develop that appreciation is to read a lot and to read with a sort of mindfulness, being aware of the language that is being used. But I really like this quote from an article about why manuscripts are accepted or not accepted. And they write as follows. Some authors apparently believe that they must impress the reader with their erudition and mastery of multisyllabic words in order for the appreciation it deserves. This is a mistaken notion. The scientific writing, the simplest and most direct statement of the intended message, is always best. Yeah, so Carol's asking the question, would this material be an example of wording in a plain language abstract? So to go back, I would say certainly that second example would be a really good way to approach the writing of a plain language abstract, because that would be more understandable to people outside of a very, very specialized area of study. And so it makes the research more accessible to more readers. There's also some emerging research that is coming in a couple of different fields. So far, it seems to be economics seems to be studying this more closely, looking at the impact of clear language or plain language or just easier to read papers on their citation numbers and their publication acceptances. But in the field of economics, what they are discovering is that papers that are more clearly written do tend to be published more readily and are cited more frequently. So there's a follow-up question. Do journals know when plain language is necessary? This type of information would be found in reviewing the journal. So if you look at submission guidelines, for instance, there will often be guidelines about whether or not a plain language abstract is required or recommended. In the same way that there would be information about whether or not you'd want to include a visual or video abstract, which are also sort of new trends, especially in the sciences. Often the sciences are leading some of these changes in academic publication because, you know, the goal is to ensure that people can access this information more readily and to connect with a broader readership. All right, so this, when comparing these pieces of text, what we're seeing is the value of reducing and simplifying words when the context allows for it. So we have lots of phrases and words that are very frequently used in academia. And I will say that I will often use these phrases when I'm writing a first draft, but then often I'll go back and try and edit them out. So phrases like a considerable amount or number of can be more simply stated as many, much, numerous, etc., etc. Has the potential to, can translate to could, taking into account, can be translated to considering, utilize or employ, can simply be used. So when we have the opportunities to reduce or simplify words, if it's going to still maintain a formal tone or a professional tone, then we have that option. All right, so I think that, this is our last example. So again, the same question, which do you prefer and why? Number one, exposure to test compounds for several days is commonly used to determine if they cause an inhibition of cell proliferation. Sample two, cells are often exposed to test compounds for several days to determine if the compounds inhibit cell proliferation. Which do you prefer and why? Mindful of, we're seeing a bit of preference emerging for that, the second example. So if you are leaning toward, if you are preferring that second example, then it might be because you really like active sentences. So this is an instance where in the first example, we have this concept of nominalization that is present. Another way of thinking of nominalization is to think of nouns as zombie nouns. And so these zombie nouns, you have the option of changing them to stronger verbs. And so that change will often require some reorganization. But in this instance, when we look at that second example, we are then putting the subject cells at the beginning of the sentence, and we are pairing them with the appropriate verb more readily. And so it might be making the relationship clearer for you as a reader. So when we think of these zombie nouns and strategies for reducing them, it's a fairly simple change. So it's mainly about building your awareness so that you start to recognize, oh, is this an instance where a noun could be changed into a verb? And the benefit of this is that it will generally lead to more active sentences, and it will also reduce wordiness, because the issue with these nominalized nouns or these zombie nouns is that you need to prop them up with prepositions and additional verbs for them to make grammatical sense. And it's not to say that you can't ever use nominalization, but if you're doing it, it should be done deliberately. So making use of verbs will have, it will just have a stronger impact in terms of readability. Now, this relates to that notion of active and passive sentences. So a quick refresher, if you're not familiar with these concepts. In an active sentence, the subject is the doer of action, and in a passive sentence, the subject receives the action. So in simple, some simple examples here. So the active sentence would read as follows: the experiment shows inconclusive results. We could state that information in a passive way by writing inconclusive results were the findings of the experiment. So it just becomes a baggier, lengthier sentence, and it doesn't really enhance the information. And so often readers will gravitate toward those active sentences instead. In the sciences, even though there is a role for passive sentences, generally speaking, there's an editorial preference for active sentences. So nature journals prefer active sentences. The Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, they prefer active sentences. Likewise, Science, all the way back in the 1960s, we're saying we want the active voice, mainly because readers tend to understand that the information that's stated more actively, more easily. So, but again, all writing has its place. Passive sentences, you can use them if you're instructed to do so, but you might just want to ask why. Sometimes they are used to communicate a sense of objectivity. So writing something like dogs were used to produce insulin in the early 1920s, as opposed to like stating how they were that, you know, dogs were sort of set up as these experimental subjects, basically. You can make use of it when the subject is not known or not very obvious, or if it's just unnecessary. So the laboratory was vandalized, or if you just want to create some sentence variety, so mixing up active and passive sentences. But generally speaking, an active sentence is going to be more valued by readers compared to a passive sentence. All right. So we've gone a little bit over time because of my connectivity issue. So this is just a checklist that you can keep in the back of your mind as you are working through your writing. So after you've written a first draft and you're starting to go through that revision process, you can ask yourself, hey, how are my subjects being written? Are they too long? Can I shorten them? Can I reduce the distance between my subject and my verb? Do I have a lot of abstract language? Can I make these ideas more concrete? Should I make use of definitions or examples? What about flow? Am I using the old new information technique? Am I making use of parallel structures? What about wordiness? How can I reduce unnecessary words or phrases? And am I falling into nominalization? Can I change some of these nouns to stronger verbs? Because ultimately, revision and redrafting is a huge part of the writing process. And it might be that through that process, you end up becoming a lot more concise in your phrasing, like this writer, or maybe you end up adding a bit more detail to ensure that your reader really has a good grasp of all that you want to share with them. All right, so in terms of some resources, this is going to be captured in the recording, so I'd encourage you to take a look at some of these. And I've just included a very, very brief annotation for each, indicating what the resource contains, what the focus of the resource is. So take some time to dig into some of those resources. There are lots of good examples out there, good resources out there for you. But in terms of some of the things that you can start to do if you aren't already in the habit of this, is keeping track of like who are the writers you admire within your field. Why do you like them as the writers? What kind of strategies are they using? What kind of techniques are they using? And can you use similar techniques in your own writing? And then sort of maintain an inventory of the strategies that you're using, and think about how you can make intentional use of different strategies to improve the clarity of your prose. So again, if you have questions, do feel free to reach out to me directly, or you can connect with resources through the library. If there are questions, I'm happy to stick around and answer them to the best of my ability. But thanks so much again for inviting me to talk to you today about science writing. And I'll just hold up one of my favorite resources, if it's of interest to anyone. Oh, is this backwards? Does it show up backwards?
Writing science in plain English.
Yeah, and look how small it is.
That's awesome, nice and tight. And really well done. I'm going to, Jill, thank you so much for being with us today. I'm going to stop the recording, but please put any questions that you have into the chat. I think I'm going to stop the recording. See if this is going to happen. There we go.